Hi, everyone. Wanted to follow up with the second half of the persuasion chapter, in which we're going to dive into some of the theoretical elements that should hopefully help you put together a very compelling argument for your persuasive speeches. So, without further ado, let's dive right into some of that content. So, in addition to selecting a great topic for your persuasive speech, you're also going to want to think about the types of appeals that you're going to make to your audience to get them to engage the desired behavior that you want them to carry out. So we would be remiss in a public speaking course to not spend a little bit of time talking about Aristotle's rhetorical triangle. So in this, Aristotle spoke about ways in which we can make appeals to audiences to get them to think or to have attitudes in line with what we want them to do, or ultimately to behave in the manner that we want to see them behave. So I bring this to our attention here for the sake of crafting our persuasive arguments today, because Aristotle talked about three types of appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. And a well-balanced persuasive argument should really appeal to all three of these elements. So let's begin with ethos, which is an appeal to the speaker's credibility. And ultimately, what is meant by this, somewhere in your introduction, you're going to want to make it clear to your audience why they should see you as a credible resource on the topic that you're speaking about. In just a moment, I'm going to dive into detail even further on what credibility is, where it comes from, and why it's so important. But understand that in your introduction, you're going to want to have a credibility statement. Now, if you haven't conducted extensive research on this, or maybe you haven't earned a degree or don't have an extensive array of experience, you still are going to want to make an effort to demonstrate why you're credible on a topic. And you might speak about the research that you have done, the data that you have sought to collect, the articles that you've read, maybe the degree that you're pursuing, the courses that you're taking, etc. You're going to need to make an effort to demonstrate to the audience that you're relatively credible on this topic. Because if you're not credible on a topic, it's going to pose a serious flaw in the argument as to why you are making it. So be sure early and often you make it clear to your audience that there's a reason they should see you as being a credible source. More on that in just a moment. The second appeal that we want to try and make is an appeal to pathos, which are the emotions of the audience. Now, this becomes really important because if your audience doesn't see your topic as being important, if your audience is maybe not invested in your topic, you may need to lean on some passionate appeals to their emotions to get them more engaged. A well-balanced persuasive argument should really have a combination of appeals to both emotions and to logic, and that is what is known as logos. So an appeal to logos is an appeal to the logical reasoning of the audience. And this is really kind of focusing on how they're going to think about the argument. So what we want to kind of analyze here as we move forward is that in your speech, you should be making appeals from each of these three areas. You should have a few main points that are focused on logic. You should have a couple anecdotes, stories, images, or other type of supplemental evidence that moves me in an emotional manner. That could be to make me more anxious, to make me nervous. Maybe it's a little bit of fear. Maybe it's to make me excited, to motivate me, to show me, to visualize what the outcomes of my behaviors could look like. And then finally, again, reminding your audience why you're a credible resource on the topic. So now that you've got that in mind, let's take it one step further and let's talk a little bit now about the ideas behind the elaboration likelihood model, what I'll refer to as the ELM. This is considered to be a relatively contemporary persuasive appeal known as a dual process model. In short summary, this theory comes from Petty and Cacioppo, and for about the last 30 or 40 years or so, it's been used to talk about and analyze persuasive appeals. And it can be boiled down to some rather simple terms. And the first term is that arguments that we are going to hear as human beings, they're going to be received and they're going to be thought about in one of two primary ways. So one way is the central route, and the other way is the peripheral route. Now, this becomes really important for everyone who's listening right now beyond your persuasive speeches, because at some point, you're going to need to persuade an audience to do something that you want them to do. And you need to first figure out what level of investment or involvement that audience has in your message, and that's going to determine what route would be best to take. So let's talk about this a little bit further. This is to say that when any human receives a message, a persuasive message in particular, they're going to think about it in one of these two ways. Now, an aside to this is that the ELM has sometimes been critiqued, and it's argued that we might actually be able to process messages in both ways. But for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of targeting your audience effectively, let's go on the assumption that they're only going to process it in one of these two ways. The first manner is the central route. And when I think about the central route, I'm thinking about audience members that are heavily invested or engaged in the topic that's going to be spoken about. Oftentimes, if I'm dealing with organizations, I'll give an example in which if a memo were to go out and the subject line of the memo were to be salary and benefits, chances are they would open that message almost immediately and they would read it quite thoroughly, right? So your benefits package or your salary as an employee, that's going to be something that you have a high degree of investment or involvement in. And what the method tells us here is that the way in which we process a message that we're highly involved in, we're likely to think about it more, we're to scrutinize it more, we're really going to focus more on the specific content, the quality of the argument being made. On the other hand, we know that sometimes there are messages that we're not all that engaged in, we're not that involved in. In fact, if you think about a variety of advertising, likely even advertising that you've seen today. So if you've been scrolling on your phone, if you've been watching TV, chances are you've come across some ads that you probably didn't even pay attention to because they really didn't have anything to do with something that you were interested in. If that was the case, then you could say that that message was likely in some fashion trying to take a potentially peripheral appeal. The peripheral route applies to a scenario in which the audience has a relatively low level of engagement. So they're not that invested in it. Maybe they don't have a lot of experience in it. Maybe the topic does not seem like something that's important to them. And as a result, the way that we process those messages is a lot different than the central route. When we process a peripheral message, we're actually going to focus more on its aesthetics, more on the cues. So it really is truly a more superficial processing of the content. And so when you think about your audience and you think about your topic, you need to begin to determine whether or not they're going to process it in the central or the peripheral route. And that should help you with where the majority of your appeal should be. So if we were to go back for a moment and we were to think about, for example, the difference between, let's say, a logical appeal, which would be the central route, or a pathos appeal, which would be the peripheral route, right? We can imagine and think about how the audience would respond to those appeals. So what I want you to concentrate on right now is assessing your audience, making a quality observation as to whether or not you think they have a high degree of involvement or a low degree of involvement in your topic, and then begin to start planning and programming your arguments, your support, your claims, your appeals, your slides, etc., based on that observation. Now, I am encouraging you to think about the fact that there will be some members of your audience, maybe a minority, that is in the other track from what you believe, and you, of course, want to include them in your messaging. So you should have a balance. You should have some central appeals, and you should have some peripheral appeals. If you don't know for certain exactly where they might be, one of the ways that you could certainly determine this is just poll a group of your peers. You're very fortunate in the sense that your audience is a group of your peers, so you should be able to determine just about, relatively speaking, where they fall on your particular topic. Let's dive into this a little bit further. If you're going to make a central appeal, right, this is going to be one in which you expect the audience to scrutinize with greater detail. Now, scrutinize sometimes kind of carries with it a sometimes connotative definition that is rather negative, but if your audience is thinking critically about your topic, that can actually be a good thing, right? So if you're making an appeal or an argument and they're thinking a lot about it, that's a good thing. That means they're actually focusing and they're paying attention to what you have to say. But of course, now the quality of the information that you're providing becomes really important. This is where your sources should be rather contemporary, or maybe your sources should be something that they would relate to. But what's also going to be important here is the logic or the rationale. So for example, when I process a message in a central manner, I'm not just analyzing the quality of the arguments or the source of those arguments. I'm also putting the puzzle pieces together in my mind to figure out, does that make sense? Is that actually how that's going to work? And it needs to convince me that it would be the case. Now, It would be said that persuading someone via the central route may be more difficult, and that might be true. But what we also know from the research literature is that if you are successful in changing someone's mind or attitude or behavior via the central route, it's much more likely to last a longer period of time. On the other hand, if you found that your audience was more likely to be processing in a peripheral manner, right, then you're going to want to be thinking about those emotional appeals. Now, the good part about emotional appeals is that they can grab and capture attention rather quickly. And that's good if you feel that the audience might not be interested in. So this is where I'm saying using an appeal that might promote a small amount of anxiety. So they're nervous, they're worried, and you're going to provide them the solution to that concern. Maybe you want to showcase the outcome. So if you were to tackle a topic such as eating healthy or working out or exercising more, we see this often used in advertising. What do we see? We see an image of a man or a woman looking really fit. And they, of course, tell us that if we follow the routine, we can look and feel as good as they do too. But we know that in order to really commit to a long-term diet or fitness program, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of logic to make sense of that. Here's something that's really interesting about the peripheral route in regards to processing. And that is that credibility actually plays a role in the peripheral route more so than the central route. Now, that might seem a little counterintuitive to you right now, right? What is credibility? Where does credibility come from? What influence does it have? Oftentimes, you would think about the basics of credibility and say, well, if somebody is deemed credible, that would be something that we would think about. But here's where it actually gets really interesting. If credibility, I'm telling you, is having an influence on the peripheral route, it means that I might not know a lot about the topic. So I'm actually going to rely on their expertise, their knowledge, as opposed to my own understanding. I'll give you a perfect example. Think about moments where you've gone to the doctor, right? Maybe you've had to go to the doctor and they've read an X-ray, or even more, they've read an MRI. And I have a great story of myself. I used to go to the doctors and I was having my knee looked at, and I've had some challenges and problems from sports from playing my knee. And I remember once getting an MRI, and I went to the doctor and I went into the room and he scrolls through the MRI relatively quickly, and he's able to go here, here, and here. See, these are the points, and there's a little bit of cartilage missing, and so we can go and we can clean this up. And of course, I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh, I guess, right? That's what you're telling me. I have no idea. I don't know how to read that MRI. So a very younger and naive Rory thought, I'll go home, I'll take my disc and I'll download an MRI reading program and I'll figure out how to do this myself. I can tell you I was very unsuccessful, and it's not something I recommend for anybody. So the point to be made here is that when we actually lack knowledge or an education or an interest, when we lack the ability, we're going to rely on the credibility of the resources in our life who give us advice. So that could be doctors, it could be nurses, it could be professors, right? It could be coaches, etc. If we're not 100% sure of something, we don't know a lot about it, we rely on credibility. So it actually tends to play a more important role in the peripheral route. Now, in addition to the peripheral cues of credibility, we also have the cues of similarity and attractiveness. So what I want to cover right now is to acknowledge that if your audience is going to process your message in a peripheral manner, then all of a sudden you as a speaker become a more influential part of this persuasive process. And the reason for that is because if they don't have a high degree of investment or involvement in the topic, they're going to rely on you, the source, to be somebody that is going to try to convince them as to why that's possible. So here are some factors that play a role here, one of them being similarity. So one of the things you can use to your advantage is if you think the audience is processing in a peripheral manner, go out of your way to remind them the ways that you're similar. Now, for you on these persuasive speeches, that's relatively easy, referring to yourself as UConn students, likely in the same age bracket, likely from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, maybe even from similar parts of the country, etc. And as a result of that, as they see themselves as being similar to you as a speaker, it should in turn allow them to think about the argument they're making from both your and their perspective. And then finally, from a peripheral cue standpoint, attractiveness can sometimes play a role, and we don't have to look much further than celebrity endorsements and advertising. If you're on Instagram, you've likely seen, right, the rise of the influencer. Many of these folks physically attractive, but also socially attractive, right? When we think about celebrities, they're typically in positions in this world. They have positions of influence, they have access. And so as a result of that, that tends to play a role We see that as being attractive. We associate their success, their attractiveness with the particular item, service, product, brand that they're endorsing, and then we begin to align those two things together. So as you go and you put the final touches on your persuasive speech, you want to take a step back and make sure that you have these types of appeals. You should be able to confirm that you have a strong logical appeal in at least one, if not two of your points. And that logic needs to be tied together in an obvious way that people can easily make sense of. So if I'm listening to your speech, if I'm evaluating your persuasive argument and it's not obvious to me how the logic flows from one point to the next, that is going to cause a problem for the effectiveness of your persuasive speech. Also, you're going to want to have an emotional appeal. You're going to want to lean on those pathos, right? And so that emotional appeal is going to be something that moves your audience to feel a certain way. Chances are you've been thinking about some imagery, maybe some statistics, some stories, some anecdotes, some quotes, whatever it might be. Those should be provocative in some way. I mentioned this earlier, but sometimes giving your audience a little bit of something to think about, making them take that step back and evaluating, saying, geez, I don't know, I never thought about this before. That wasn't something that I challenged in my day-to-day life. Making them a little bit uncertain, making them a little bit uneasy about something that they currently do or don't do. You then have the opportunity to provide the solution to ease that anxiety and get them to do what you want them to do. And finally, don't forget about your credibility. And that includes the sources that you're using to align yourself with credible sources, right? They say that you are who your friends are. And so in this case, you are who your sources are. So the sources that you bring into play will be a direct reflection on your credibility. And we'll be using all of that information to assess your credibility as you are speaking on this topic. So with that being said, best of luck putting together these speeches. Looking forward to seeing them, and I hope that they are as successful as you want them to be.